Testing. All right. Is this on? Can we all hear this? Okay, wonderful. Well, let's get behind the podium so we're all placed in the right space. Well, I want to begin by saying thank you all, everyone, so much for coming out here today. My name is Bren O'Connor. I am the diocese's missioner for LGBTQIA plus ministry and engagement. So a couple of months ago, I got this email from the Reverend Charlie Bell that had been sent to our bishop, mentioning that there is a book that he had written that's coming out called Queer Holiness, the Gifts of LGBTI plus People for the Church. And he was interested in doing some speaking engagements here in the United States. I was excited because, well, speaking engagements are fun, and I've never planned one before, so I thought this would be quite the experience. I had the honor of reading the book, and it was the first time I had read a book of any kind of writing, any kind of queer theology or writing about queer people in the church that just flatly denied or flatly did not want to engage with any of the clobber verses, any of the passages about why we are bad or don't belong. It just took as a given, saying that we do belong here because there are queer Christians. They are around us. We can see them. They have always been part of the church. We know they belong here. This is our starting point. Now, where do we go from here? And to read that was so reassuring. Because we are kind of in a special time, as churches have been welcoming and also accepting that queer folks like us have always been part of them and part of our leadership. To quote Charlie in a recent blog post, "We don't live in the tweedocracy of the Edwardian era when everything was terribly nudge, nudge, wink, wink, and the clergy had their secret clandestine affairs with young men. The current situation is not only infantilizing to the clergy and the partners involved in the UK, it is patronized to the laity, and it is clericalist in the most unappetizing way, and is ultimately a potential safeguarding risk. Dancing around the issue, refusing to be honest and open is potentially dangerous, and it is pathetic." Well, in the spirit of Martin Luther, sometimes we gotta be a little mean and funny at the same time. So I'm really honored to bring Charlie in here today to speak about this experience, about what does it mean to look at the experience of the church as we are living it for the people who are the most marginalized, and where can we go from here? So I would like to just read a prayer really quickly before we start. This is a prayer for openness. Lord, open our eyes, that we may see in you our brothers, our sisters, and our siblings. Lord, open our ears, that we may bear the cries of the hungry, the cold, the frightened, and the oppressed. Lord, open our hearts, that we may love each other as you love us. Renew in us your spirit. Lord, free us and make us one. Amen.
Great. Is this working as well? Yeah, okay, great. I can't hear myself very well, so it's clearly working better for you than it is for me. It's really great to be with you. I feel very strange behind a lectern. I haven't celebrated Mass for about a week, which is like the longest since I was ordained priest, so it's quite strange to be up by an altar. It's lovely to be with you all, and thank you so much for offering this space to speak to you all in. There's a sort of inbuilt arrogance to the Church of England, because we think we're reinventing the wheel each time we do something new. When we released our documents, we've been going through the most recent in our learning and listening exercises about matters of sexuality, which basically means homosexuality, and gender, which kind of means we're not really sure what we want to talk about here. And we have a church in which we have structural elements in place which make women priests in the Church of England less than male priests. We could talk about that ad nauseam, but that's not what I'm here to do today. When we released these most recent set of learning materials, the Bishop of London, who I think has done a pretty astounding job in holding this stuff together and has faced the most abysmal misogynistic abuse, I mean, just appalling, she said, and rather naively, I just hope that these resources we put together as a Church of England are going to be a gift to the wider Anglican Church. As though nowhere else had considered this. And I was saying when I was in Chicago yesterday, had a slightly blue DM on Twitter from a bishop who will remain nameless in the Episcopal Church, who let me know that this wasn't perhaps his understanding of the situation, which I thought was fascinating because we really think that we're doing this for the first time, that the church is doing it for the first time. And I'm really, really grateful to the Episcopal Church for refusing to back down in the face of intense pressure from the Church of England, from the Anglican Communion, and so on. I was in Brent House last night in Chicago talking to some of the Anglican community, or the Episcopalian community at University of Chicago. And they very clearly told me that the Episcopal Church still hasn't sorted itself out yet, but at least we have marriage. And I thought that was quite an interesting place for us to find ourselves in, because I think we in the Church of England are probably going to do the same. We're going to not really sort ourselves out at all. We're not going to mention sex, but we'll talk about everything else, and we'll talk euphemistically, and we'll talk about marriage. And what the Church of England will not do is allow same-sex marriage, or marriage as we call it. We won't allow that to happen for people of the same sex, or same gender. But what we will do is some kind of sort of blessing process, prayers of blessing. And now we're having arguments about whether we bless individuals or couples or relationships or what. And I'm afraid my response is, I do a lovely nuptial mass. I'll just put some bits of prayers in here that you would find elsewhere. So anyway, so that's where we find ourselves as the Church of England. So I just want to give you that kind of context. I'm just going to give you a few more bits of context from the Church of England just to show you where we're coming from, and possibly to give you an idea as to where some of the challenging behaviour at the Lambeth Conference came from. So in the Church of England, we may not, and we're explicitly forbidden from blessing or saying specific prayers for people who are in same-sex, same-gender relationships, number one. So clergy cannot do that. Does that mean it doesn't happen? Absolutely not. It happens behind closed doors. So I think the words are, it can't be specific and public. So if you remove one of those things, so you can have private services of blessing, or at least that's how it's been interpreted, or you can have non-specific, but you happen to have a weekday service in which you bless two people of the same sex, same gender. So we can't do that. That's one thing we can't do. Clergy cannot get married to someone of the same sex or same gender. So laity can, because what's the church going to do about it? For us, if we get married, we will not get a license in our next parish. They can't sack us because of the strange way that the Church of England works, we own the living of where we are, so they can't push us out, but we won't go anywhere else. So we get married. But we can have what we describe as a civil partnership, which is marriage without vows. So it's a legal document. The Church of England opposed this when it came in 2004-5, vehemently. This was a scandal. It was going to destroy the social fabric of the country, until 2006, at which point they then said to all clergy who were in same-sex relationships, you must now enter into one of these. Fascinating how time changes so quickly. So we can enter into those, but we cannot enter into same-sex marriages. And we also must agree to abide by a document, which I talk about in the book, called Issues in Human Sexuality, followed by the almost too excitingly named Further Issues in Human Sexuality. And Issues in Human Sexuality is essentially not a book about issues in human sexuality at all. It's about homosexuality, and it's primarily about male homosexuality. That's primarily what the document talks about. And it basically talks about celibacy. And the key take-home is you have to assent to it, and if you assent to it, that means you assent as clergy to living a celibate life. if people come to us for prayers or blessings, what we're officially meant to do is we may pray with them privately, but we must, at the same time, remind them of, teach them, the teaching of the church on this matter. And the teaching of the church, again, the Church of England in its arrogance, the teaching of the church, universal, is marriages between man and woman, as we go. So that's where we are as the Church of England. We've seen some changes this year, and I'm very happy to kind of talk about the communion or the Lambeth Conference towards the end if people are kind of interested in any of the ways that things have happened there. In terms of trans clergy, 10, 15 years ago, we had quite a number of trans clergy, and nobody really batted an eyelid. It just happened. And the only thing which was really, and this just goes to show how quite bizarre we are, the only thing that people were concerned about was that if somebody transitioned from male to female, then could they or could they not become a bishop? Because up until 7 years ago or so, we didn't have women bishops, or bishops who happened to be women. So that was the issue. It was, well, what on earth do we do with this in terms of bishops? And what happens if, God forbid, a male bishop transitioned? It didn't happen, but those were the questions that were going on. We had affirmation of newfound identity rights, and various descriptions of them, and these were all went through General Synod without much, and our Parliament, which is like General Convention, but far, 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 far more disorganized and badly run. This went through General Synod with no difficulty at all, or very little, the usual murmurings, but nothing much. Nobody really cared. And interestingly, in reference to marriage, if you transitioned as a clergy person to then be in a marriage with someone of the same sex or the same gender, the church was very clear that you shouldn't divorce. So you could have clergy in same-sex, same-gender marriages, provided that when they entered into the marriage, that wasn't the case. We like to live in the grey area. So that's where the Church of England was. So it's a kind of interesting mix of things. The only time that trans issues, or trans people rather, have become an issue in the Church of England has been in the last 2 or 3 years, when the culture war has ramped up. And we hear a lot about how it's a theological this and gender ideology that and the rest of it. Actually, this is about culture wars in the Church of England. It's got nothing, it has no theological basis to it whatsoever. If it had a theological basis to it, we would have talked about it 15 years ago, and we didn't. We absolutely didn't. Anyway, so that's where we are as a church. So we're basically a mess, and it's lovely to have Episcopalians trying to show us how we could do it. I want to talk today primarily about some of the themes in this book. And the book is a kind of, it's a bit of a love story, but it's sort of a sad love story to the Church of England, in a sense, saying, why are we doing this so badly? But I think it's wider than the way that we think of things in the Church of England. Bren mentioned at the beginning, I'm just not interested in debating about clobber texts. I just don't care. I have been there, I've done that, I've sat in the rooms of people who have told me, but have you not read Romans? And I've said, yes, I have. One of my little Lenten disciplines this year is to read through all of Paul's and not Paul's epistles. And I tell you what, when you read them as an entire epistle, that's a very different game than when you turn up and hear them in the daily Eucharist every so often. Because you don't cut out a little passage and then say, see, and that's the message for today. You read the whole thing. So Romans, for me, is a great example of this. We often hear from Romans, well, have you not heard, homosexuals are in that list of people who are on their way to hell? And firstly, no, they're not, because the word homosexual didn't exist. Let's just start from there. So translations are not the original, and translations are interpretations. So let's put that to aside for a moment. Read the whole letter. Is that what St. Paul is actually talking about? What is he saying, if it is St. Paul? Probably is. What is St. Paul saying when he's talking about the different groups of people that we often are thrown at? Well, you're in this list of bad people. And what St. Paul is often saying is he's using particular examples of either Greek behavior or non-Jewish behavior, saying so these things are happening outside of the Jewish religion. Or indeed, these are things, particularly when we look into the Jewish Bible, these are things which the surrounding nations are doing, which you should not be doing because you need to keep yourself pure in honor of the Lord. Paul is often doing that, and Paul is therefore using them as a kind of look what they're doing, look what you're doing, and in Romans in particular, look at them, look at you now. Neither of you are actually perfect, but you're both saved by grace, and isn't that remarkable? Which incidentally is the Christian gospel. So that's what he's doing in Romans. But also, Paul talks an awful lot, and this is why I think experience is important. Paul talks an awful lot about these things that he points to in different groups of people. He points to those things as examples or ways of finding out or seeing that people are not trusting in God, or they're not living a good or Christian life. So what we have to basically say, if we're going to follow the arguments, the proof texting arguments, is not that because in that list, homosexuals, again to use the wrong word, going to hell. What we actually have to say is that homosexuals are a reflection of what happens when you turn away from God. Therefore, homosexuals, again to use the word, are turning away from God because they're homosexuals. So that's a good example. That's how we can tell they're turning away. And because of that, therefore, they're going to hell. So it's not actually that because you're gay or lesbian or bisexual or whatever, you're going to hell. It's because that is the reason that you're bisexual or gay or lesbian is because you've turned away from God in the first place. So we're actually talking about fruits of the Spirit. We're talking about, and Paul's understanding and writing through all of this is saying, this is what happens when you turn away from God. In my congregation, or my boss's congregation, that I am very humble in and simply serve, in my boss's congregation, there was a wonderful couple, older gay couple. One of them was from the US, one of them was from the UK. And really elderly. I'm not sure exactly their age, but I mean, I'm not offending anybody by saying they were extremely elderly. And one of them, and they got together before it was legal to be together. And one of them died on the day of my first Mass, and had Alzheimer's for a long period of time, really severe Alzheimer's, to the extent that it was very difficult to care for him. And those of you who know people who have had Alzheimer's or have experienced whatever will know that can be very, very upsetting and difficult for individuals, both for the person involved and the person caring. So Frank died on the day of my first Mass, and Tom, who'd been looking after him for months and months and months, died 2 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks ago, almost 3 weeks ago now. I gave him the Holy Communion on the Thursday, and he died on the Friday. Tom was the most unbelievably faithful person I've ever met. I'm going to preach about him after Easter, and he'd hate it as well, which makes it even better, because he can't stop me now. And Tom had the most unbelievable faith. So when I went to go and see him in the hospital and gave him the Holy Communion, Tom was sitting there and had just been told, he thought he had prostate cancer, he thought he'd had ages, and then it ended up being really devastatingly quick. And they said, you've actually only got months, and then they said, you've only got weeks, and then you only have days. And in my day job, I'm a doctor, and I was reading his notes and thought, crikey, this is not good. And I said to him, how are you feeling about this? In that sort of slightly trite way that clergy sometimes accidentally do at the bedside. How are you feeling about that? Thinking, probably not great. And he said, oh, it's okay, the Lord's in charge. And I thought, gosh, give me a quarter, a tenth, and 100th of the faith that you have when I'm facing the same situation. And he said, the Lord has supported me this far. He's going to support me for the next bit. I'm not worried. I've done what I can. I can be angry about it, but what's he going to do? I'm going to die. We're all going to die, and my time is coming now. And he wanted the Holy Communion. I texted him a couple of times and said, would you like the Holy Communion? Thinking, in my slightly embarrassed English way, no, they'll probably say no, thank you. He said, oh yes, that'd be lovely, thank you. Brought in the Holy Communion several times. And he, as a holy person, was definitely a holy individual. And his holiness, he told me, his way of being, he would never probably admit to being holy, but he certainly was. His way of being had been fundamentally shaped by his relationship. fundamentally shaped by it, and particularly by the caring towards the end. And what we need to say then, to return to this argument from St. Paul, or using St. Paul in that way, is that actually all that we're seeing from this relationship is a mirage. All the holiness that Tom showed and that Frank showed together, all the love that they had together, all of that's a mirage. Because St. Paul says that kind of behavior is an example of what happens when you turn away from God. And I can't believe that to be true. I just can't believe it to be true. Which brings us on to how do we do our theology? What do we do? How do we actually engage with questions of theology? And I think this is much bigger than actually questions of sexuality and gender. I think it's how we do theology in total. How do we actually engage with questions, or theological questions, or indeed questions, because all questions are to some degree theological. We can't separate the two, I don't think. So how do we do it? And I think there is a role for experience and for science in this. I want to talk about science first, because so in my day job, a night job sometimes, I was just saying that doctors have all decided to go on strike in the UK. So I'm not sure it's much of a job at the moment, but anyway. When I'm actually at work, I'm dealing with psychiatric patients, very unwell psychiatric patients. I deal with, I deal with, it's a terrible phrase, I treat people who are on the interface between the law and hospital. So people who are really, really sick and have often done things which we would call terrible if we observe them. Sometimes I think we need to observe them more carefully. It's very easy to say that murder is wrong, for example. It's much more difficult to say that someone who has a psychotic illness, who ends up hurting or killing somebody that's close to them, is that it's the same level of moral agency or the same level of moral or culpability. And then we might think of someone who has an addiction. Then we might say, well, if they hadn't drank, then it wouldn't have happened. But then we might think about their history and their impact. And so actually the whole context of human life in psychiatry is wonderful, because you have to engage with all of it. You can't just turn up and have easy answers, because these people are people in the image of God in the same way we are, which is great, because it reminds us that I'm not as bad as I think I am sometimes. So let's think about the science. So I think we actually need to develop a deeper love of the science and scientific method as Christians, because we've spent so long being scared of science, or just suspicious of it, or frankly thinking it's not very important. And then we pronounced upon theological questions, or we pronounced upon questions theologically without actually knowing what we're talking about. So the church, I think, and I'm particularly talking about the Church of England, but I'm sure it might just have shades in the Episcopal Church as well, sometimes talks about things, and in so doing makes it very clear that they don't know what they're actually talking about in the first place. So we will often talk, there's a really good example about marriages between a man and a woman. Okay? Back to real basics here. And we have debates about what a man and a woman is. Now, I'm not talking here about gender, I'm talking about sex in the first instance. I'm talking about what is it that in a newborn, for example, we will call a newborn either male or female. What is it from a sex perspective? Now, the usual answer now is the Y chromosome, XX. And I've just seen something today, so I thought I was slightly overstating the point, and then I saw someone write exactly this instead. It made me very pleased, because it's exactly it's exactly the mistake that people are making. People will say it's the X or the Y chromosome. So if you have XX, you're female, and if you're XY, you're male. That's the kind of go-to, very kind of traditionalist perspective. That's how we go to it. And of course, we know that that's firstly not true, because you can have a damaged Y chromosome, or as you go through the system, the Y chromosome might not do what it's meant to do. Tiny little molecule that's tiny, tiny, tiny little protein that's responsible. And sometimes the genetics don't align with the anatomy or the hormones and so on. So it's far more complicated than we would like to admit. We often say, well, no, that's how we make our decision, which is fine until you realize that genetics, or genetics as a discipline, didn't exist 100 years ago, or at least not in any kind of serious way. Mendel might disagree with that, but with his peas in a monastic garden, but in terms of knowing about the X and the Y chromosome. Which means that we can't just say we're going to determine what a man and a woman is based on the Y or the X chromosome, because actually and this is my favorite phrase, for the entire history of the Christian church, we've done the very opposite. We have not focused on genetics as our basis for sex. We've focused on presentation of someone, how someone appears to us. The us is an interesting power dynamic there, but how someone appears to us, or how someone appears. So genetic sex is not enough to determine what male and female is. And then, of course, we have people who are born intersex. And intersex folk get really ignored in a lot of the debates around sexuality and about gender and about sex, which I think is really a scandal. When I was at university many, many years ago, I asked one of the chaplains there what should happen to someone who's born as a primary hermaphrodite, the scientific term, someone who has one gonad that is XY or that's male and one gonad that is XX. Who should they marry, I said? Because they are, quite literally, male and female, he created them. And the answer, after a lot of umming and ahhing, was, well, that's just an exception, so. And this is my big problem with when we start trying to do categorical theology in that sense, where we're basing it on things which actually don't stand on solid ground. Because people become exceptions. And the whole point about the Christian faith is that people are not exceptions, and indeed our entire salvation history is based on a person, not on a group of texts, on a person. So we can't just say, it doesn't matter. We can't just say, oh, it's an exception. Because this person in front of you, this exception, is is created in the image and likeness of God in the same way that we are. Oh no, we hear. It's all about the fall. And those of you who have encountered such arguments will find, and the fall being Adam and Eve turned away from God and had some lunch, and things went wrong. And that kind of theology, or the use of the fall to explain things that we don't like, is just a circular argument. Because we see something that we don't like, then we say, oh, I don't like that, and I'm not sure how that fits into how God does things. And then we say, yeah, but the fall happened. And we say, so it must be because of the fall. And on we go. So everything we don't like is because of the fall. Examples in history: women having jobs. You'll see it. Why are women now feeling they should have jobs? Oh, let's have a look. Bible, Genesis. Oh, yeah, there it is. It's the fall, see? And on we go, and on we go. And I happen to think that at the heart of an awful lot of questions of sexuality and gender is a deep-seated misogyny. Deep-seated. We can maybe talk about that in the questions. So, the fall doesn't convince me, as will not surprise you hugely. I go into that in a bit more detail in the book. So we have to come back to, so how are we doing our theology? How, if we can't go on to kind of categoricals about people in that way, how do we do our theology of what is right, what God wants, or rather what is acceptable? And I think we have to take science into account. I think we also have to take experience into account. So I want to talk about experience now. And I want to talk about experience from a slight side angle, so bear with me. About 10 or 15 years ago, the big arguments were proof texts, and the big arguments were about sex, as in the act of sex, sexual act. Well, I've used the phrase now sexual activity, because that's what it's being used as in all of our beautiful missives from people who think people like me should be immediately thrown out of the church. So sexual activity. And that was what the arguments were actually at. And it's really interesting, we've moved in the last 10, 15 years, particularly even on a kind of global scale, towards talking about marriage primarily. Marriage, which I think is understandable, because marriage was quite a sort of a clear, distinctive thing which prevents or prevented people from from being in a particular state, particularly with legal things and so on. So actually, if you were not married, you were less than, which I think is a dangerous thing for us to be saying anyway. But I also think that I can understand why queer people would go, well, hang on, so why? It's still a barrier to us. So, but we've moved towards marriage away from talking about sex. But actually at the heart of it is sex. It's just we don't want to talk about it. And so we say, and this is what we hear all the time, marriage is between a man and a woman. Insert definition here. Sex is for marriage only. Ta-da! Sex is only for men and women. And so actually, we're still talking about sex. We're just talking about it with the marriage hat on. And I think we need to talk about sex itself. So forgive me, it's Saturday morning. You've not had your lunch yet. So it'll be fine. So why do we need to talk about sex? Because I don't think sex is a thing in and of itself. Or at least I don't think it's primarily a thing in and of itself that can be boxed up or packaged up and taken away. I don't think that, not because I've got some kind of sort of wacky new ideas, but because basically the entire history of psychology tells us that it's not a thing that's packaged up separately and taken away. And our biology as well would suggest that. So there's very little that really supports the idea that one thing is sexual and another thing isn't sexual. So if we go, again, back to this poor chaplain, this poor man, he had to deal with me as an undergraduate. I said to him, after having asked him about how intersex people should get married and receiving my very raised eyebrows when he came up with a terrible answer, I then asked him about sex and said, well, tell me, Father, which annoyed him as well, but tell me, Father, what is sex? And he spent about 2 minutes thinking about it, which for him was quite a long period of time, and then said, well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? I said, well, help me here, because I'm a foolish undergraduate, help me. And he said, well, I mean, the most obvious form, of course, is, and I warn you, this is going to be terribly graphic, is penile vaginal penetrative sex. We should be able to talk about that. The law doesn't mind, he can manage it. God can manage it. So that was the first answer, is penile vaginal insertive or procreative sex. And I don't think procreative is the same word as reproductive, and I think that's another question, but we can talk about that maybe later. And I said, well, that's fine. But actually, in the vast majority of same-sex or same-gender relationships, that's actually not the issue. Because that's not what we're talking about, because it ain't happening. And he looked at me with this kind of look, which he looked at me more and more frequently through. I was there for 9 years, and by the end, I'm not surprised he retired. And he looked at me and thought and said, that's true. I said, well, that's fine. And I said, actually, if that's the issue, if we're worried about reproduction being part of all of this, then that's okay, it's not. So actually we're not, so if that's what sex is, if sex is innately reproductive, and I draw your attention to lots of marriage rights which make it clear that sex is, and what they're talking about is reproduction in the context of marriage, and therefore sex is the reproductive element, and it must be reproductive. If sex in same-sex, same-gender relationships is not, by its nature, reproductive in the vast majority of cases, or potentially reproductive in the vast majority of cases, then we've not got a problem. We might have a problem about including people in marriage, but we don't have a problem with the sex itself. Just get on with it, doesn't matter. He said, no, come on, obviously that's not the case. And in the end, we got to this rather beautifully naive description of what sex was, and he said, well, I think probably sex is what you wouldn't do with a friend. I thought that was beautiful. He'd been in Cambridge for 20 years by this stage, and had clearly met 0 undergraduates. And I thought, well, that's a really interesting perspective, actually. And another definition over time I've kind of come up with is kind of sexual activity, or things which we would describe as kind of overt sexual activity, is the kind of thing that if you were in a monogamous partnership, you wouldn't feel comfortable your partner knowing about. I actually think that's not an unreasonable description of what sexual activity is. At least it's a nod towards it. But the fact that he recognized that it was what you wouldn't do with a friend, suggested that there was some element of context to sex. Sex in itself is contextual. At least the majority of it, or sexual contact is contextual. So we can, and what I was hoping he would do is give me a list of 10 things which you can do and 10 things which you can't do, and that would make life a lot easier. But of course people can't do that because it's ridiculous. And an example of that would be holding hands, for example. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that holding hands is having sex with somebody. That even for my most radically conservative, that's not what I think. But holding hands with someone can or cannot be a sexual activity, or have some element of sexual or at least intimate ontology to it, nature to it. So, for example, in England, if I'm walking down the street holding another man's hand, firstly, my partner would kill me, but secondly, it would, and quite rightly, because it would be seen as something which is ultimately pointing towards the romantic, the intimate, the sexual. Not necessarily sexual in itself, although there are elements of it which it could become so. And particularly in people who are in advanced stages of dementia, for example, and the rest of it, actually there's evidence that touch, simple touch, is much more sexual than it is for people who have sexual faculties as we would normatively see them in place. Anyway, when I was younger, in the Diocese of Chichester, which is a very beautiful but slightly old-fashioned diocese in the south of England, we have a link with lots of churches in the Diocese of in the province of West Africa. I went to Gambia, and I was walking down the street, and when we were crossing the road, my guide would take my hand, and we would cross the road, because that's what you do. It's normal. It's not sexual at all. And it would be absurd to suggest that was a sexual activity. So same hand, same action, different context, and therefore different meaning. And therefore, yes, sexual or no sexual. So I don't think we can easily define something as yes, sexual or no sexual, based on what you're physically doing. It's not about what, where, and how. It's about what does this mean? And that is the problem with saying that people who are attracted to someone of the same sex or gender should not have sex with one another or should not have sexual activity with one another. Because firstly, it's difficult to say what it is, but actually, we're not talking about sex at all. We're talking about relationship. And relationship matters because it's sex as a form of relationality between two people, or I call it relational sexuality. Relationship matters because that's what the Bible's all about. People say to me about the proof texts, you ignore the proof text and so on and so on. I'm not ignoring the Bible. The Bible is quite clear about covenanted relationship. And this is where it starts to matter, because what we're saying is that people who are attracted to someone of the same sex or gender, and this includes, and bisexual folk are a fantastic example of why the categorical nature is nonsense, because where and when does it become a problem when it's someone of the same gender or sex as opposed to someone of the opposite gender and sex, and where's the right and the wrong thing and so on. And I'll explain what one of our delightful organizations has told me is the issue. But we're talking about relationship, and we're talking about the development of relationship, and it matters because, as I said, it's about a reflection of the relationship of God. And what we're saying is that people who are attracted to people of the same sex or same gender cannot form the same type of relationship, or should not form the same type of relationship as people who are attracted to people of the opposite sex or gender, because it would inevitably or have some form of sexuality within it. It doesn't always, and marriage relationships don't always have sexual content within them, but that is a potential within that kind of relationship. We're saying they shouldn't form it. But what we're actually never saying in Christian doctrine, and in particularly moral theology, at least any serious moral theology, we're never saying shouldn't, we're saying can't. Because we're not saying that man should not lie with a man as with a woman is an abomination, if we're reading the scriptural narrative effectively. We're saying that in doing so, you're not actually doing the same thing as if a man was lying with a woman. So two men lying together cannot be the same as a man and a woman lying together, because it's not possible. Because actually the thing that it does to your identity as a Christian, your identity in Christ, your ontology, your nature as a person, cannot be the same as if you were doing it, for example, with a woman rather than with a man. And this is the same in terms of relationship. So we're not saying you shouldn't form sexual relationships. We're actually saying that you cannot form sexual relationships. So whatever you see in terms of a sexual relationship between two people of the same sex or gender is not actually a relationship at all. And particularly, it's not marriage. And we hear this quite a lot I hear it particularly from the US in terms of, there was something about, and I'll pronounce his name wrong, Pete Buttigieg. Is that right? Quite good, I think. I go to Malta every year, so that's my attempt at speaking Maltese. Pete, he's not married. People say he's not married because it's not possible. He can't be married. He's not married, which is obviously nonsense, but that's what people say. And actually, I kind of like the honesty in a sense to that, because it's at least an honest position where you're saying, actually, relationship is not marriage. But if we're saying that relationship is not marriage, we're actually saying that I once used the phrase same-sex attracted, which is what we seem to keep using in our general synod, and I don't like it. People who are attracted to people of the same sex or same gender, those people are, by their ontology, by their nature, different to people who are attracted to people of the opposite sex, because they are unable to form the relationship. And that relationship, if we think about marriage and Christ's church and the rest of it, is a reflection of God's relationship and God's covenant with humankind. So what we're saying, actually, is that people who are attracted to people of the same sex or gender are unable, by their nature, innately unable to reflect God's relationship in the same way that people of the opposite sex, or people attracted to people of the opposite sex. Now, we know that is absolute tosh. Very British. Is that a very British word? Aye, okay. There's always one that sneaks in. Probably more, actually. But we know that's not true. So we know that the nature of the relationship, or at least when we're looking at what we see from relationships in terms of fruits, in terms of goodness, in terms of outcomes, in terms of holiness, in terms of growing in holiness and the rest of it, we know that that's not true. But that's what saying that two people of the same sex or gender should not have sex with one another ultimately leads to. And I think this is what we need to be much better at doing, is forcing people through to the end of their theological line of thought. For example, Tom and Frank, back to Tom and Frank. I, as a Church of England priest, could never call them married in a formal liturgy of the church until they were dead. At which point, I could say, Tom, we bless Tom's husband, Frank, and so on. I could never say, I pronounce you husband and husband. I can never say, I pronounce you married. I can never refer to their marriage formally, because if I did, I could be disciplined for doing so. Until one of them is dead, and therefore it's no longer a risk. Now, that seems to me to be absurd. I couldn't do their marriage. But then there's also a final element to this. Why am I allowed to give Tom, which I will be, and I think Frank, I think I did his memorial as one of the concelebrants. Why am I allowed to give them Christian funerals? Because they died in sin, unrepentant. Now, again, I don't believe that. You know this. But that's what we end up saying. If we're saying that their relationship was sinful, we're saying that actually they were turning away from God, it was an example of them turning away from God. Actually, offering them a Christian funeral is dishonest. And the church permitting me to offer them a Christian funeral is dishonest. Because the church is saying what they had is not good. Now, that for me is obviously an absurd position. I don't want us to get to the position where we're not able to offer people who are in same-sex marriages or marriages a funeral. But why is it that we're not willing to reject people's funerals when we are willing to reject their marriages? And probably it comes down to us being a bit queasy and feeling a bit awkward about the whole thing. But as I'm told frequently by colleagues, it's not about feeling queasy. Jesus was very clear on all of this. So why is it we won't face bereaved people and speak the truth in love as we're told to speak to people when they come to us for marriage? Why is that different? I want to just finish by giving you an example of where this all ends up. So there's an organization in the Church of England referred to as the Church of England Evangelical Council. The Church of England Evangelical Council claims to speak for all evangelicals. I'm afraid that's not the case. And evangelical in this kind of speaking means someone who is opposed to same-sex relationships. So in England, evangelical has lost much of its meaning and is now about same-sex relationships. Used to be about women's ordination. So if you're evangelical, you oppose women's ordination. Now you have evangelical women who are ordained. So we've now moved towards evangelical, meaning opposed to same-sex relationships, same-gender relationships, and very, very much opposed to transliberation. And the Church of England and there's lots of people who would deny that and would say, actually, we're evangelicals and that's not what we think, but that's what the narrative has become. And the Church of England Evangelical Council has been very keen on preventing any form of change or talk even about sex. And the Church of England's Evangelical Council has said the following about relationships, same-sex, same-gender relationships. And we'll use their terminology. Some suggest, I don't know who it is, but some suggest that one way forward is that same-sex attracted people, quote, should be able to form covenanted relationships, such as civil partnerships, so long as they don't engage in sexual intimacy. We've spoken about why all of that's really bizarre in terms of that's not the same covenant, and that would be very difficult as a covenant when we know that sex builds up and all the rest of it. But this is their wording, so I can't be held responsible for that. And then they say, but if their relationship is fueled by mutual sexual desire, and here's the crunch, it is actually built on a temptation, and we are called to flee temptation. The basis for the relationship would not be the covenant that God has established, open brackets marriage, just in case we didn't know this is about marriage, nor could it be headed for this. All of us instead should seek to serve one another's deep need for friendship in the means that God has appointed, particularly loving our brothers and sisters in our church family, end quote. That's where this ends up. And where it really ends up is in, and I want to kind of return back to this right at the end, is in, firstly, a refusal to recognize the role of discernment in the church, which is where actually a theology of experience and science comes to. It's about discernment. And what these folks are saying is there is nothing to discern on this, specifically nothing to discern on this issue. God cares so much about people who are attracted to people of the same sex or gender having sex with one another, that there is no discernment left, because the Bible is very clear. Jesus doesn't happen to mention it. None of the gospel writers mention it. Paul probably doesn't mention it. And it's very, very infrequently mentioned elsewhere. But nonetheless, this is something that God really cares about. And there's no place for discernment. So we start off with that there's no place for discernment. But we also end up in a place from this kind of context where we actually talk about us and them. Because this is not written about queer Christians. It's written about the church and them. And the key thing that experience and science and everything else does, and that the spirit of discernment does, is remind us all that when we approach here, none of us are the host except the Lord. So we even call the wafer the host. And yet every time we talk about other people in this way, as though they are not Christians, and we have to find out what to do with their problem, i.e., we read the church through a cis, white, male, heteronormative lens, and we call that the plain reading of Scripture. Every time we do that, we are denying what we're doing at the altar, at the holy table. That is fundamentally against who we are as Christians. I'll just finish with this quote from the Church of England's marriage service, which, this is the one I use. I think it's like the alternative to the alternative. The beginning of the Church of England's marriage service starts like this. Marriage is ordained by God between a man and a woman. And it says at the bottom, this preface does not need to be used, as long as it is incorporated effectively into the rest of the service. There's ways of incorporating. And this is one of the really nice things in one of the other prefaces to the marriage service. I want to end on it because this for me is actually what this is all about human relationality, about people of different sex, different gender, about us living together, not even just in marriage. But this is about relationality. This is what it says marriage is. It is given that with delight and tenderness they may know each other in love, and through the joy of their bodily union may strengthen the union of their hearts and lives. That is what relational sexuality is. We already know it exists, and yet we continually find ways to keep people away from it because we're worried, I think, about what would happen if we recognized they were equal members of the body of Christ, equally imago Dei as we are. Thank you.
All righty. Well, we get to the fun part of our gathering here. Do we have any questions or things? Yeah?
Go back up.
All right. Well, thank you for coming all the way across the big river, the big ocean, to come see us. Thank you so much. So my name's Abby. I'm local here. I go to this church. I go to this specific church, actually. And I'm also a member of a local organization that works with the transgender community called Metro Trans Umbrella Group. And I was just, I like to be a thinker, and I like to kind of find, the interesting kind of like, what about, how can we dig deeper into this? And one thing you said was that, about the idea that some people use is that being gay or lesbian or bisexual is turning away from God, and that there are passages in scriptures such as in like Romans that could point towards that, but it sounds like don't actually point towards that. Are there actually parts of scripture that point that straight people are turning towards God in their relationships?
It's a really good question. I might just add to it, because I like to answer questions I've asked myself. Where does God say in Scripture that opposite-sex sexual activity is a good thing? It's there occasionally. Go forth and multiply. It's probably one, but it doesn't say go and have sex and multiply, and there's lots of reasons for that, partially because it's, again, back to our tiresome discussion of the fall, because before the fall you didn't have to have sex to multiply, but only after the fall. Seems a bit unlikely. But actually, if we look at opposite-sex marriage, people get very frustrated and angry when you call it that. It's just marriage. Yes, I know, we've been telling you this. But when we look at opposite-sex marriage in the Bible, for example, not usually a great record. And opposite-sex relationships in general. There's a couple of examples when things go better than they could have done. There's an awful lot of examples where actually it's a catastrophe, and it's usually a man being a man, generally. So the Bible is not full of wonderful examples of opposite-sex sexual activity being somehow the zenith of the human existence or the human life. St. Paul is clear, don't get married, or don't have sex, but if you have to, get married to deal with that kind of icky stuff. And I think actually that's one of our problems, because we've bought into such, particularly a Protestant reading of St. Paul, and the idea that sex is bad, basically. And I'm not sure that is the case, but I think scripturally, the idea that there's some kind of great glorification of opposite-sex sexual activity is not true. The Song of Songs, I suppose, is another place, although, of course, you can only interpret that allegorically, which is obviously ridiculous. If you read the Song of Songs and you have a mind, by the end of it, you're like, oh, there's a lot going on here. And even when you get to the end of one phrase, you're like, you read the next phrase, you're like, maybe they didn't mean that. And then you read the next phrase, you're like, oh, they did mean that. So it's a good question. I think reproduction is probably the key thing that we need to engage with in terms of opposite-sex sexual activity. And I think we can't ignore that. But then when we talk about marriage as a sacrament in particular, I was at Notre Dame on whatever day it was, Thursday. First time I've ever given a talk where there's been a police escort, which was very bizarre. And then I did a seminar the following morning, and with a group of students who were more conservative than me, certainly, which is not enormously difficult, but nonetheless, they were. Actually, I think that's untrue, but we can cover that another time. And one of them was talking to me about the sacrament of marriage, and about how aren't we just redefining marriage and the rest of it, and actually the sacrament of marriage requires reproduction. And in the Book of Common Prayer, the real Book of Common Prayer, the 1662 version, in the Book of Common Prayer, we talk about marriage being for three things. Firstly, to stop you having sex with everybody else, and to try and ensure that you only have sex with one other person, and that your sexual desires are oriented that way, for the bringing up of children and for mutual comfort in society. And he was saying, actually, we've redefined marriage, and so it's not marriage anymore. And I said to him, and I thought it was quite an interesting thought, because it just came to me suddenly, which biblical marriages are sacraments? just look back through biblical marriages, because there's not biblical marriage, obviously we know that's not true, but look through biblical marriages, what the Bible calls marriages, plain reading of Scripture. Which of those are sacramental? If we're going to talk about sacraments. Which of those reflect the love of God for God's church, for example? And then you might say, well, some of them have kind of facets of it and so on. And it's like, yes, that's what we're talking about. Relationships have different facets of reflection of God's relationship and God's covenant. So in sort of short, I mean, that's a very long answer to your question and then a question I made up for myself. But yes, I think we need to be quite clear about things like that and actually challenge it and say, particularly marriage, heterosexual marriage or opposite-sex marriage is so often presented as the only Christian way. Jesus invented the family and the nuclear family and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, which Bible are you reading? Which Bible are you reading? The same is true of celibacy, particularly in the Anglican tradition or in the Episcopalian tradition. Well, probably not in the Episcopalian tradition, but in the Anglican, certainly in the Church of England. Celibacy is never presented as an option for heterosexuals. Celibacy is always something that homosexuals are called to. And it's like, well, maybe actually the history of the Christian faith talks about sex and celibacy and things in ways which don't refer to sexuality until the 20th century. So why is it that we're just doing that? So I think it's really important to actually name those things and recognize that probably marriage, 2 parents, 2 kids, is not actually what Christ ordained as much as we're told it is. And just to be really controversial, I don't think God or Christ ordained marriage either. But we can talk about that.
So I very much appreciated your book, and one of the things that this diocese has journeyed through with a previous bishop is the idea of more queer-friendly and certainly leading to, at that point, same-gender blessings and then eventually marriage equality. And it's interesting that one of the big showdowns between the community and the previous bishop was here at Holy Communion. And it was really interesting both using the diocese as a microcosm and the Episcopal Church as a macrocosm is, and it very much echoed in your book, that the order of bishops, because they were felt absolutely 100% focused on unity, whatever that is, and the defenders of the faith, almost militaristically. It was interesting how it was the order of the lay people and the diaconate and then the priests that really sort of pushed that and pushed that and pushed that, and finally, again, I personally think through women's ordination, finally got over it because there were alternate voices. So I say that as a preamble. I very much liked your the way you talked about control as being one of the things, and would like you to speak a little bit about how control of their narrative, control of theology is one of the things that sort of enshrined in the order of the bishops, especially as the state that we're in right now is trying to sort of toss out any other narratives except for that sort of white, hyper-focused narrative. So again, I know that's a lot of stuff, but again, if you can talk a little bit about control, that would be awesome.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think we face, actually, just sort of picking up on your preamble, I think we're facing the same thing. So the reason that we're actually going towards blessings possibly of people and not relationships in the Church of England, our new radical step, is because in 2017, the House of Bishops of the Church of England, which is the most closed-shop organization or group of people I have ever come across. I mean, it is unbelievable. And I mean that, it's actually unbelievable. People do not believe what you say about the House of Bishops. I might just mention that in a moment. But they brought a statement to the General Synod of the Church of England. And we, in our church parliament, we have the House of Laity, the House of Clergy, and then the House of Bishops. And they brought through this statement in 2017 after the most recent set of pointless, facilitated shared conversations that we were having. And they said, we really, really feel like we've been a bit beastly to gay people. And that's pretty much all they said. They didn't really talk about anybody else. It's just we've been a bit beastly to gay people, by which they meant mostly their gay colleagues, and their gay male colleagues. We've been a bit beastly to gay people. So whilst we don't want to change anything, we just want to say we're going to try and be a bit less beastly, full stop. And the Church of England's General Synod was asked to take note of this, and take note is a marvelously English thing, where you accept that you've read something. And it doesn't really mean anything at all. It doesn't give it any standing. But the House of Clergy in the Church of England said absolutely not and rejected it. And there's a wonderful, again, it's very geeky, but in the Church of England, if you want to pass something in the General Synod, or rather if you want to make sure something doesn't pass, you call for something called vote by houses. And so every house has to vote in favor of it, which has been used ad nauseam in the most recent Synod debate, which is why we debated whether or not we could maybe do blessings for people for almost 12 hours. Because there were something like 20 amendments, all of which we're wrecking. And the clergy said, absolutely not, we're not having this. And that's what's led to us moving towards this new position. And the bishops, all of them, voted in favor of this idea that we've been beastly, we'll try to be less beastly, apart from one who pressed the wrong button by mistake. And who was actually opposed, which is fascinating. So he was actually one of the most conservative and voted against their idea, not because he opposed it on conservative grounds, because he didn't know how to use a button. But the control and the power thing is absolutely, I think, central to these conversations. And actually, that's why I think, firstly, queer people offer a fundamental challenge to the way that we do theology in general in the church. I think that's a good thing, because we say actually that power differential and the idea of the kind of cis white heteronormative male lens is actually not plain reading, but is a lens, and we are just naming that we have a different lens, and then suddenly people go, oh, maybe we have our own lens. Yes. So I think we're a good challenge, but I actually think that's true of huge groups of people who do not fit into that kind of normative understanding of what being Christian is. So we are Christians and we have to deal with other people. So the other people end up being disabled people, being black people, being queer people, being women, particularly being women. Fascinating. 50% of the population. We talk about it as though it's a minority issue. And you're like, have you read the statistics of the UK? This is a majority issue, which we are still so bad at that we're still talking about it as a minority issue. It's an extraordinary situation. So I think there's a huge. So I think we offer a lot of gifts, but I think the control from bishops is driven primarily by fear. And I actually think our bishops in the Church of England are, and they're beginning to speak out, but up until last year, I think 2 or 3 bishops had an opinion on this matter, a formal public opinion, 2 or 3. And every time you said to them, what's your opinion, that word unity came back. Oh, we can't have an opinion because it will destroy the unity of the church. And a quick plug, I'm actually writing a book on unity because I got so excited, or rather irritated, by the concept of unity, and I was asking, what does unity actually mean? So hopefully that'll be out later in the year, looking at the Anglican Communion and unity. So unity has become the go-to word. But what unity actually means is we're scared that people are going to take our money away. So in the Church of England, and it's happened, for years, bishops, and I've sat across dinner, I quite get on with it. I have this sort of reputation for being very mean to them. We actually get on quite well, because I kind of listen to their whinging and then sort of say, oh, I know, isn't it difficult, you know, and then we have a nice glass of wine. But bishops have been saying privately, that we are being threatened by particular large parishes with lots of money in our diocese, to the extent that when we looked at blessings in the Church of England, one of the big pieces of work that was done was a risk register on what would happen if they did allow blessings and that money was removed. So this has been in the milieu for ages, but no bishop has had the courage to say, if I say I'm in favor of even blessings of same-sex couples or same-gender couples, then the money from the following 5 churches will be removed because they've written to me and told me. None of them would say that. So actually, I think our bishops were much more scared than powerful, and the control is coming from elsewhere about controlling that theological narrative. At the Lambeth Conference, Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, really upset a large constituency in the Church of England by saying there are 2, and this actually I think was rather helped by the Episcopal Church. I've heard all kinds of different reasons for why it was said from a lot of different people who have their own reasons for saying why it was said in a particular way, but I think Michael Curry and others are rather more responsible for this than the Archbishop might admit, said that there are a variety of perspectives in the Anglican Communion which have been come to through integrity and through study of the Scripture that do not take Scripture lightly and do not take this issue lightly, and are not trying to throw out Christian tradition and history and understanding, but instead come to different perspectives. And both of those perspectives are held in integrity. He didn't say they're equal. He didn't even say they're both valid, but he said that they both exist. And the Anglican Communion and the Church of England as a microcosm of it have spent the last 20 or 30 years trying to pretend that wasn't the case. We've spent so much time pretending that there's no division. Because if you pretend there's no division, then there's no division. And people say to me, why do you keep talking about this? Because you're dividing the church. And much like bishops don't create unity, they reveal it. I'm not creating division, I'm revealing it. I think that's a more fun thing to do than being a bishop, actually. But that's where we are. We've actually been in a church which is driven by fear, and where the levers of control have not been clear at all. And we have been having a go at the bishops, and I have been having a go at the bishops for ages about not saying anything. And I think they've been cowardly. I think some of them have been cowardly in the Church of England, to be honest, especially when they'll tell you across the dinner table, especially when one of them was outed or was about to be outed by a newspaper. And then he then just said, oh, fine, yes, I'm gay. Because we had a moratorium, because of Gene Robinson, we had a moratorium on ordaining gay bishops. Not gay bishops in same-sex relationships or same-gender relationships, not sexually active gay bishops, but on gay bishops themselves. And they were gay bishops at that point, because it was male bishops. We had a moratorium on even ordaining gay bishops. I mean, I'm fascinated how you find out. You're at the sort of job interview, and at the end, they're like, just one final question. I mean, that's probably what they did. I mean, the Church of England is absurd enough to have been doing that. They check how many bedrooms you have in your house, for example, to make sure that if you're in a same-sex relationship, you don't share a room, if it's a church house. If you go to seminary and you're in a same-sex relationship, you get a 2-bedroom house, because obviously you wouldn't be sharing the same room. The fascinating and brilliant thing is, of course, then when the heterosexuals end up going to seminary, they only get a 1-bedroom. So all of the people who are in same-sex or same-gender relationships are like, yeah, we got loads of space, we got a living room, we got this, so which is fantastic. It's a sort of final kick to the system. But when the Bishop of Grantham came out, albeit under duress, none of the other gay bishops in the Church of England put their hand up and said they were gay. 0. And I know they are because they tell me they are. We talk about it openly. It's an open secret. And we're just saying on the way here. And they don't do it because they don't want to cause scandal. And they don't realize that it is a heck of a lot more scandalous for people to know that you're gay and that you're hiding it because you're embarrassed about it, or that you're being secretive about it. That's a lot more scandalous than just being open and honest about it when everybody knows about it anyway. But we have fomented a culture of fear in the Church of England, and I think in the wider Anglican Communion, where, and again, thank you, Episcopalians, you will not do it. I mean, not least because Americans can never be quiet. But that's great. You're honest about and you're honest about the divisions. We have instead built this culture of not talking about things. And that's how we end up where we are now, because when you take the pressure valve out, off it goes. And if you read the church press in the UK, I expect in England, not in the rest of the UK, they've sorted themselves out more. If you read the church press in England, it is horrendous. I mean, it is just, Christians see how they love one another. I mean, it's just horrendous. Horrendous. But, yeah.
So I know you touched on this just a little bit.
Yeah.
But in your opinion, do you see the House of Bishops going forward any time in the future with saying yes, same-sex marriage or marriage? Because I hate that term, same-sex marriage.
Too, yeah.
We are married. We
Yeah.
are. It's not
Yeah.
that he's same-sex.
Yeah.
Do you see them going forward? Because I know with them ordaining women, that was a big thing. I'm a big fan of the Vicar Dibley, by the way.
Yeah.
So I know that was in play, and they changed their mind. So do you see maybe that happening in the near future? Because I know we did not in the church, and all of a sudden, it flipped.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. The Vicar of Dibley is one of the main reasons. For those of you who don't know, it's sort of this very slightly absurd sitcom about a woman vicar against whom everything goes wrong, and who lives in this vicarage and has the most appalling church council, and is worryingly close to home. So, but that was given as one of the main reasons that women bishops actually went through, because it was just so normal that actually the cultural element, the cultural change in terms of women clergy was just so, it was like, well, yeah, what? Who cares? And it became a who cares issue for the state. And I think actually that's where we are in terms of same-sex, or in terms of equal marriage. In terms of whether they're going to make a difference, it's about politics. So, well, it's about politics and not about politics. So the bishops of the Church of England's statement, when they talked about same-sex marriage in England, or equal marriage in England, was, we do not think we can get this through the General Synod, therefore we're not going to try. What they didn't say, and they said, and there's divisions in our house and the rest of it, what they didn't openly say is what the percentage in the House of Bishops was in favor of going forward to full equality, and what the percentage was against that. They stopped short of doing that, which I think is, again, a cowardly move, to be honest. I think they should have just been honest. Bishops they can't change the rules. They can't change the rules by themselves. So just be honest about what their perspective is, and maybe then we ask bishops to teach. I mean, that's the teaching office is part of the bishop's role. So it'd be nice to say what they feel should be taught. So I think there probably is just about a majority in the House of Bishops of the Church of England to push forward for equal marriage. But we don't need a majority, we need 2/3 majority, because it's a doctrinal issue. And that's where we're stuffed, because I'm not sure we've quite got 2/3. House of Clergy, you could probably just get 2/3 if you kind of lock the doors to some people's hotel rooms. I think mostly you could get 2/3. House of Laity, you wouldn't get 2/3. But so the way that the Church of England Synod is elected, all the diocesans are there. There's a couple of suffragans that are elected on, although the suffragans that are currently on were not elected. They were actually the ones that failed to be elected, but then the ones who were elected have become diocesans, so they've just floated up. There's an unfortunate idiom that you could use about things that float. But the bishops that have joined the House of Bishops now are mostly diocesans with a few suffragans. The clergy are elected directly, so we all get a ballot paper or like an email thing, and then we elect them, and they all lie on their election statements, and then we all go, okay, and then we vote for them and hope that we've made the right decision. The laity are voted, I don't know if it's similar here, the laity are voted for, you have to be elected onto the church council. The church council then has to elect you to be a deanery synod rep. The deanery synod reps then elect someone from the rest of the diocese. So it's not a direct election, it's an indirect election of somebody, which is why, if you run a really careful political campaign, you make sure that deanery synod is stuffed full of your people, and that your people are also filling the ballot papers, and on it goes. Not that you're faking them, but that you have the right people in the right places. So the laity won't allow it. So I think the problem with same or equal marriage in the Church of England is actually our tricameral system, the fact that the Parliament requires 2/3 in each house. That said, we have politicians, and we're an established church, so we have the bishops in the House of Lords and so on. And there have been parliamentarians who said, I think we should change this to half. We should change the rules in synod. Which they could do without consulting synod. We should change the rules in synod to make it a 50-50, so 51% this would go through. Now, I think if that happened, which I think could happen if this continues for much longer, because we're refusing to marry people as an established church, I think if that happened, we could see same or equal marriage within the next 5 to 10 years. But I think if we don't see that, at the moment, I would only be trusting in the Lord that it would happen, I think.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll have some closing words from Reverend Mike Angel.
So I'm Father Alan Young of the Companions of Dorothy the Worker, and first an observation. I was at Cudston when Jeffrey John was nominated and all of that mash that happened. And at that time, you know, women, if a female priest was the celebrant of the day at college, then there had to be a separate offering of the Eucharist celebrated by a male. And things are changing. So I want to note, you know, at a specific point in time, there was a change.
Yeah.
And I truly believe that we will see further development in the Church of England and greater change, greater inclusion, I don't know if it's going to be full inclusion before the eschaton. I have no idea.
Yeah.
But what I'm most curious about is, what do we see as the next point where the work of queer theology and of liberation will find its center?
Yeah.
As we move from sexuality and gender, what is next after that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, on women's ordination in the Church of England, we still have diocesan bishops who don't accept the ordination of women. And if you're a woman priest in that diocese, tough. You don't get another bishop. We also have male clergy who don't accept the ordination of women to the episcopacy, to be bishops, and they get their own bishops. Which is a fascinating, again, back to that lens through which we see things. The central lens is male in that context, and then we deal with the women issue, rather than the other way around, which is a kind of interesting reality. In our diocesan conference, we had a special mass on the day that our female bishop was presiding for the clergy that wouldn't receive from her. And I find that strange, particularly from a movement that describes itself as Catholic. It's interesting that the thing that we call Catholic is not having women ordained, as opposed to the jurisdiction of the diocesan bishop. And if you look into the councils of the church, one of those is very particularly Catholic. But anyway, referring to queer theology, I think we need to move beyond the apologetics of now. There's a book, isn't there, and the author's just left my mind. Beyond Apologetics, that's it. Yeah, I can't remember who wrote it. It's called Beyond Apologetics. That's really bad. It's slipped my mind. But anyway, actually, that phrase is exactly what we need to do. So I think we have spent years arguing for a place at the table, and I don't think, actually, and back to your question, so when's it going to change? In a sense, for me, I'm not sure we're going to change it by continuing to have the same arguments. So I think we need to have the best arguments we possibly can and enunciate them the best ways we can and forcefully express them the best way we can. But I don't think that having those arguments is necessarily going to change anything. I think we almost need to just take a step back and say, right, we know we're right on that, and we just have to wait for the church to sort itself out. So what? Or move forward. Yeah. But exactly. Well, that's it. So we say we just have to wait for that, and that's not going to change immediately. And actually, that can't be our goal. And I actually think our goal as queer Christians shouldn't be equal marriage. That's not to say it shouldn't be part of what we're aiming towards, but I actually think that's not it. And I think that's a mistake. I mean, dare I criticize the host? I think that's one of the mistakes potentially the Episcopal Church has made, or at least publicly, or in some circumstances has made, saying that, well, we've done equal marriage, so we're fine. And I don't think that is enough. I think we actually need to think about back to the subtitle of the book in a sense, what the gift of queer people is to the church itself, what doing theology through a queer lens actually does to everything about the church. So what does it, for example, back to marriage, we can say we're now included in the marriage, not to say included in the marriage bed, that's a slightly unfortunate phrase, we're included in the marriage thing, which is fine, and I think we should be. But if we don't, by being included in that, offer any reflection on the institution itself, i.e. about who giveth this woman. I hate doing that bit at the beginning of the service, and every bride wants it. Who giveth this woman to be wedded to this man? And I think, oh, how lovely, yes, it's nice. And actually looking at the liturgies of the Episcopal Church, where the marriage service for people in equal or same-sex marriage initially is actually quite different and has reflected back on to an understanding of marriage more widely. That is what queer theology can do. That's where we will move forward, rather than seeing ourselves as having to kind of be included in heteronormative ideals. Now, that's not the same as saying we need to redefine everything and say that there's no sacraments of the church and everything's up for debate, or rather that everything is up for destruction. Debate doesn't lead to destruction, and reflection and interrogation and refinement doesn't lead to destruction. So I think queer theology is an interrogating and a refining force in the church, fire in the church. And there's kind of biblical context for some of that. I think we need to keep our eyes on the prize beyond marriage. And the prize beyond marriage is a better church. Not just a better church for queer people, but a better church. And I think, in a sense, we just need to start doing that work now, whilst at the same time not saying, so let's just give up on marriage. And so I think we have to hold those two things together. And in a sense, I hope that's something the Episcopal Church is kind of keen to do, certain people in the Episcopal Church are keen to do. And I hope it's something that in England we are open to doing as well, even though we see the door being slammed in our face in terms of marriage. And I think that's hard for people. Anyway.
Wrap up the formal time. I hope Charlie can stick around for a couple informal. I love that place where you finish in terms of what does a better church look like. Here in Missouri, just this week, we passed 2 of the most discriminatory laws that we've seen in the state against the trans community. And by passed, the Senate passed them, and now they're waiting to almost definitely pass the House. And so a group of clergy started coming together, and there are now over 300 clergy signatures from clergy in Missouri that will be published in the Jefferson City, the Capital's newspaper, this week, condemning all 30-plus laws that have been proposed. So I think one of the pivots that the church is starting to do, and I say starting, but definitely starting to do to become a better church, is to say, we've fought these battles internally for 20, 30 years. It's time to go stand with the LGBTQ community outside of our walls, and in a state like Missouri especially, stand with them in a way that could potentially make a difference. So Wednesday, I'm here mostly to invite you all. Promo, our partners in LGBTQ activism here in Missouri, are taking a bus trip, and they're organizing a big protest at the Missouri Capitol to try to say, let's not let this legislation get any farther. The likelihood is it's going to get farther. This is not one we're likely to win. The governor is likely to sign it, but it matters that we go show up. So if you scan those QR codes in the pews, or if you're online, if you go to holycommunion.net/info, the top click link is the information about the protest on Wednesday. You can sign up to ride the bus. You can drive yourself in carpool. We would love to have people show up on Wednesday, and there will be a lot of clergy there. The last thing that I get to do as the rector, as one of the priests here, is to say thank you. Charlie, both for your talk today and because I'm a little older than you, I think, and have a number of queer clergy friends in the Church of England. And I've been watching your presence, and I know how much your unabashed and brave voice in the midst of this discussion in England has mattered. And so thank you for being here, and thank you for all you have done. And will you join me in thanking Charlie?